is 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll let any late signers on catch up as they can. For those who don't know me, my name is Darren. I'm the nursery manager at Shonnard's, and today I'm here to talk to you about basic drip irrigation. Drip irrigation can be a very, very broad topic. So there's no way I can cover all the permutations and possibilities of drip in a simple class. My goal here is to get you familiar with the basics of drip, how to lay out a simple system, the components involved, and some of the options of components involved, how to make the connections in the proper order, and how to actually put the parts together so that you can actually get started on this. And once you've done it a couple of times, you know, the hands-on learning is often as valuable or more valuable than any structured class. But a lot of times people are a little uncertain at the very beginnings of how to get going. And that's kind of the goal of this class, to get you to the starting line and comfortable with the basic components so you feel like you can tackle this project and learn as you go. So we'll start off by talking a little about what is drip irrigation. And it's kind of I actually don't like the term drip irrigation. It's an old term. Drip irrigation is only one component of what we like to call microgation. So we're trying to control the amount of water application to make sure the plants are getting enough water, but they're not wasting water in the process. So the goal with drip irrigation or microgation is to precisely water directly to the plants. And with true drip components, it's actually right at the roots on the soil itself. Drip irrigation and other form of microgation uses low flow rates and relatively low pressure. This has some significant permutations as you start getting into working with a system, because that will become your limiting factor in what you can not do with a given system. Drip irrigation isn't always just about drip. It often includes various types of soaker hoses, smaller soakers than your traditional hose attaches, and often in many cases, micro sprayers or similar bubblers that apply slightly higher volumes of water and slightly less precisely, but are still compatible with the basic principles of microgation or reducing water waste. Now, drip irrigation is a wonderful thing. It is set up to innately be easy to automate, so you can use it on timers and you don't have to pay attention to it all the time. Drip irrigation and other forms of microgation are highly water efficient, which means that you're using less water to accomplish the same amount of growing. You're not having erosive problems through over application of water. You're not watering weeds and other nuisance situations. And in many cases, you're not watering right on the leaves, and you can actually reduce some diseases, particularly foliar and stem diseases on plants, because they're not getting wet every time the irrigation runs. That's not true for all forms of microgation, but it's broadly true. So drip irrigation is a wonderful thing to do for environmental reasons, but also simply for efficiency purposes. Now, that's not to say that it's perfect in every situation. Drip systems, there's a certain amount of initial setup costs. You've got some physical materials you have to buy, and there's an investment of timing to get it all put together and assembled correctly. So drip systems are better for watering relatively small areas and for deeper watering. They're very well suited for putting a small amount of water and watering down into the soil profile. They're less adept at providing water over a large area, but shallowly, although there's ways around that to some extent too. So in practical terms, that means, and we'll talk about some of the limitations of pressure and flow, but it means you have to set up multiple zones for large areas because you can't do it all at one swipe because of the limitations. And it typically means that there's a substantial amount of expense per square foot to providing irrigation, especially to larger areas. You know, you're dripping a small bed along the side of your house, maybe a couple of planter boxes. That's not very expensive and that's not very complicated. If you're trying to do your entire backyard with a separate system for the vegetable garden, a separate system for the hanging pots and color bowls on your deck, that's more involved and can often be more expensive. That's not to say it's not suited. but there are limitations to its adaptation. You may choose to find other ways to dealing with at least some of these situations. You're not going to drip system or even usually microgate a lawn, for example, or a very extensive area of ground cover, because it's just not efficient. A kind of a hidden problem, situations that come up, because as we know, all mechanical things are not perfect and things do happen. When you hook up a hose to a sprinkler and it doesn't work, it's pretty darn obvious. Either you've got a fountain of water where the hose or the sprinkler itself is failing, or it's obvious that it didn't run because things aren't wet, or you can even see the lines where if things weren't adjusted quite right, you can see the line where it's dry over here and wet over here. Problems and errors are inherently obvious to even a very casual examination. This is not often the case in drip systems. Water is being applied in a very, very tiny areas, particularly on the soil surface, a very tiny area. And a lot of times the components are buried or partially buried in the ground. So when problems do occur, it may not be obvious until plants are suffering or until you have other really dramatic symptoms that something has gone wrong, that you can't tell that your timer didn't work on a root system, on a drip system, when all the drippers are right up against the crowns of the plants and you don't see the water application. And so that's definitely a limiting factor in these. You need to pay that attention to a drip system because it won't let you know automatically. So pros and cons of drips aside, there's just some basics to making this whole thing work. And that's where we're going to get started into the nuts and bolts of actually running a system at this point. So the components of a system are basically three categories of parts. You have connection parts. These are the parts that actually attach your drip system to the water source. For most small-scale, do-it-yourself home drip system people, that's simply going to be something that hooks up to an existing hose bib, an existing faucet. For more involved or more professionally designed and installed systems, that might be an underground timer assembly that connects to the main water line and to a timer that's operated off your power supply in your house. But your connection parts are what get the water to the drip system. The supply parts take the water from where you make the connection and they take it out to where you need it to go broadly. So if your hose bib is on the side of the house, but you're watering your vegetable garden 30 feet away, you're typically going to make your connection at the hose bib and have your supply parts running out to where the area starts, where the actual distribution starts. This includes larger scale connectors and larger size tubing, like what they call half-inch tubing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Finally, the distribution components are the parts that direct and control the actual application of the water. In old school systems and many modern systems too, very traditional systems, that is simply drip emitters, things that give a regulated amount of water right where they're put. But that can include soakers and micro sprayers, staked risers for the micro sprayers, and the smaller distribution tubing that makes sure that make sure the water's getting right exactly where you want it, or connecting those stakes and sprayers to the larger system. So when you're doing your connection to your water source, there are some basic parts you just need to be kind of familiar with. You need some sort of a manual shutoff to give you ready control of the system if you need it. Typically, it's not ideal to hook it directly up to the hose bib without something, and it can be as simple as a standard manual shutoff, plastic or metal shutoff that just threads right onto your hose bib. Ideally, you should use some form of filtration on a drip system because small particles can gum up the works and give you problems. On city water on a small system, you might potentially be able to get away with none, but we still generally recommend it. There's just a lot of stuff that happens to get into the systems that can foul up the little tiny emitters on the far end, and then you don't realize something's not working right. For most types of application, 150 micron filters work fine, and you can get filters that are designed to hook right up to the standard hose thread connection. If you're doing super low flow parts, like if you're doing a lot of the pre-emitted 1/4 inch soaker with really, really small emission points, you might want to go up to 200 micron filter just to make sure. Or if you have a well that is notably sedimenty, you might want to put up a 200 micron filter just to ensure less problems. So the larger the number, the smaller the filter holes, the less stuff gets through. You do not have to run a drip system on a timer. You can certainly manually turn them on and off on your own. There's nothing wrong with that. But one of the big advantages to drip systems is the ability to hook them up to timers and have them run consistently. So the timer component is a simple way to automate the system. And in-ground installations usually use a separate timer unit, like a wall mount timer unit that controls several zones at once. And then they have an in-ground solenoid, the part that actually opens and closes when there's power, that actually controls the turning on and off of the individual zones of that system. So you might have, for example, a 6-stage timer zone on a wall with low voltage wire running out to each of 6 different in-ground buried solenoids that control very much like an in-ground sprinkler system for a lawn. Most smaller scale homeowner design systems are simply going to use a timer that hooks directly up to the hose threads. These are usually one piece, or sometimes they allow for two separate zones off the same hose bib. Simple systems are run by battery. The better ones, a battery will last an entire season, but does need to be replaced next year. We'll talk a little bit further down about how those work. Hose timers don't last forever. They're not made to the industrial standards of the wall mount timers. If you get 2 or 3 years out of a hose attached timer, you're doing pretty good at it. And that's all we really expect them to be good for, unfortunately. Too many things that can go wrong with them. But that gives you an option to automate the system. It is part of that, making that connection. A very important component of drip and micro-irrigation systems is the pressure regulator. So when you tap into city water line, you're getting, depending on what your pipe diameter is and how far you are from the street connection, a whole slew of other factors, you're getting somewhere in the neighborhood, usually of about 60 pounds per square inch. 60 PSI, might be as high as 80 in some areas, might be a little lower in a few others. So these drip system parts, both the supply line parts and the distribution components, are not designed to run at that high of pressure. And things go wrong when they run at that high pressure, which can include catastrophic failure, like parts actually coming apart. These components are designed to run at moderated pressure, usually 30 or 25 PSI, although you can certainly go all the way down to 15 PSI in certain conditions. So 15, 20, 25, and 30 PSI regulators are all pretty common. For most applications, any applicator will work. We'll talk a little bit more about benefits of different sizes here in just a moment. But do regulate the pressure. Theoretically, you can fine-tune your system by controlling how much water is feeding into it by hand and not have to pressure regulate it, but the chances of something going wrong are pretty high unless you are very, very experienced in doing that. Pressure regulators are not cheap, but they're not super expensive. They're well worth installing. The systems are designed to run with them. And then once you've got all those connection pieces on, you need the actual connector, the swivel connector usually for a hose attached system that converts from a standard threaded hose fixture like you're used to off of a hose or hose bib to a compression fitting that will actually supplies the water to the supply line, the 1/2-inch supply line. It does matter what order you are putting these components together in. Typically, the first thing you want, of course, is your manual shut off. That gives you the ability to readily control the water, even without turning on and off the actual hose bib itself. Even in-ground systems on fancy timers that are PVC solenoid and then a pop-up to get out, still have a manual shut off in case you need to, for example, work on the system. You don't want to go all the way back and drain the whole system out and shut it all off back at the street. So good idea to have one of those on. It's the first part of your attachment sequence. The next part usually is your filter, because even the timers might have small parts that could fail if they get too much debris in them. Filter will simply protect the system from debris and fouling. Then your timer, if you're using one. The reason the timer goes next is kind of important. The pressure regulator comes after the timer. And if you were to set up your system to where your pressure regulator came first and then your timer, you could have that pressure regulator fail. They're not designed to have a constant pressure against them the whole time, which is what happens when you have an on system. Anything behind the timer is constantly on at full hose pressure. If you put the pressure regulator before the timer, then usually within a couple of months, your pressure regulator starts leaking because it doesn't handle that pressure. It's not designed for that constant pressure against it all the time like that. So after the filter, then your timer, then your pressure regulator. And from your pressure regulator, we go directly to the hose swivel or other supply attachment and into your supply line, your 1/2-inch line. So that's your primary connection parts. There are some other things that you might look into. Anti-siphon devices are certainly a good idea. The anti-siphon goes usually before your shut-off device. In other words, connects directly to the hose attachment. And what that is designed to do is prevent water that's sitting in your drip system when it's not running from suddenly flowing back into the main well or main city water supply if you had a break further back upstream before, from the city line itself or from the supply line to the hose bib itself. So this is to prevent contamination, particularly of bacterial and fungal organisms from the water back into your water supply. In practice, a lot of people who are doing hose attached ones don't set them up, and it's an added safety measure, but a lot of your hose bibs give you a certain degree of protection against anti-siphon as well. I recommend them. A lot of customers don't use them because it's kind of an optional component. Timers are really, really, really variable. We talked a little bit about that. They usually run off AA or 9-volt batteries. Learn your models and make that decision of what one you're going to play with based on some experiential data. So there's usually some trade-off between purchase price and durability of the timer. There's a lot of brands out there. The brands do switch, and over time, some of the brands that were reliable become less reliable. Some of the less reliable brands have become more reliable. So it's not a perfect world in that regard. But typically, you're inexpensive. You're paying $30 to $50 for a timer. You're going to get a few years out of it, and that really is all that's to be expected. You can expand that lifespan dramatically by taking proper storage precautions on your timers. When they are not being used for the winter, take them off the hose bib, take them inside, store them someplace where they're not going to freeze, and take all of the batteries out. Failure is a multi-component thing. They can fail due to freeze damage causing fractures, and it doesn't take much freeze. You never get all the water out of them, even when you take them off. There's always small amounts of water after they've been used stuck inside the mechanisms. If you get a hard freeze on that, they are going to crack. Battery decomposition can ruin your contacts and make them fail. There's been a real push in terms of making these things easier to use, to have these LED digital programmable timers. And it's a really nice thing for programming. You can kind of see what's happening. You can see what the program has been set for. The trade-off is, unfortunately, those LEDs on a lot of these inexpensive models are not very good. And that's often the component that goes out in, say, 3 years or so. I've got a couple of timers at home that I can't do anything with simply because part of the timer works, but I can't read the display anymore to set it or monitor it to know what it's doing. So obviously at that point, when you can't set it appropriately, it's no longer functional. More expensive timers are certainly out there, and you can do a little hunting around for different brands. I'm a fan of Klaber myself, but they are significantly expensive. I've got Klabers at home that are over 9 years old and still running just fine, but they are 3 or 4 times the price. It's easy to spend $100 or $150 on a timer to be more reliable. So once you've got your connection made, now you need to get the water from the connection point out in the vicinity of the plants you want watered. And to do this, we use supply tubing. They usually call this half-inch tubing. That's a complete misnomer. In fact, if you go around and hit several different stores and look at several different brands, you'll see that there's actually a whole batch of different sized, quote unquote, half-inch tubing. The most common dimensions, there's a little bit of actual true half, which is much smaller than you think. There's a lot of 0.620 inch and a lot of 0.7 inch. They call 700 tube and 600 tube colloquially. The important thing out there is not to say, for me to say, this is the size you need. The important thing is when you are buying system components, make a note of what kind of supply tubing, half-inch tubing you are buying. Because parts from one will not fit parts of the other. You can usually find parts for most of the common sizes out there if you do a little shopping around, but you can't go to a store, get a half-inch compression fitting and expect it to be usable on all the 4 or 5 or 6 different sizes that are commonly available. So make a note of that. 700 tubing is common, 620 tubing is common. Most other sizes are uncommon, but they do exist, they are out there. It's important to understand that once we put that pressure regulator on, we have really changed the dynamics of water flow in the system. So once you have put that pressure regulator on, you have only so much footage of this half-inch supply tubing that you can run before the friction loss has pretty well balanced out any usable pressure in the system. The more times you put a T in it to split it off, and the more times you put an elbow in it to make a sharp right-hand turn, the less footage you can safely use, because that again affects the available pressure and water flow, available water in the system. Changes in grade and elevation also make a significant difference in performance. Yes, you can even post pressure regulator pump uphill to a point. But the more change you have in elevation, the more problems you're going to have with footage, and the more inconsistent the available water and available water pressure in the system will be. We tend to be really conservative when we're talking to new prospective drip system builders. If we say we can use about 200 feet of supply tubing per timer zone, that's a really, really cautious, safe number. You'll see plenty of systems out there that definitely exceed that. I also don't want you to think that 200 feet per zone is an absolute. It has to do, again, with some frictional loss and distance past the pressure regulator. So if you have a pressure regulator and your connection, and then you run 200 linear feet of hose and stop, you're good. There's no problem there. But that doesn't mean you can only have 200 feet on that system. You could have 150 feet out to a stop, but in the middle you could put a T and run another 100 feet off of the T. With one T, you're not costing yourself too much. Now you've got 250 total tubing feet on that timer zone, but you still have less than 200 feet from the pressure regulator to the farthest end point where you run out of water. You can't do that infinitely. You can't do 150 feet and do 10 100-foot laterals off of that with T's. We've talked about the T's limiting that, but also there's simply only so much water in the system at that point once you put it down to 25 or 30 PSI. But 200 feet is absolutely safe. There's often ways you can exceed that, and it's 200 feet from point source, from pressure regulator to farthest end, not 200 feet total tubing overall. So to maximize the efficiency of your supply components, try to avoid making right-hand turns. And if you're going up over the wall into a raised bed, or if you're going up a post to a deck rail and then going to go lateral, those pretty much have to be right-hand turns. You don't want loose, floppy tubing making those connections. There are situations where you're coming around a house and maybe your pathway is corner of a house, maybe your pathway is right there and you only have a few inches to make that. You probably are going to want to put an elbow on that to make that right-hand turn. There's reasons you have to do that sometimes, but the more you can avoid it, the better. The trade-off to that is you can't make a sharp enough slow curving turn to cause a crimp in that tubing. When you try to turn too far too fast, the tubing will actually crimp. It'll create a kind of a crease in it, and it'll fold over, and water no longer goes past that crease. And that obviously makes the system not work. So it's a balancing act. Where possible, slow curving turns. Where you have to, make right-hand turns, but try to avoid it. When you're laying out a system, don't expect to stretch that tubing tight, and nail it down to the ground with staples or anything of the sort. When water comes into a system that has air in it, and where there's very small release points, we get what we call a water hammer effect. And so that water surging through that system with the air trapped in it is going to create this knocking and shifting around. If you try to stretch to get the absolute most linear footage out of your tubing and you nail it down tight, you're going to create enough pressure through water hammer going into the system that the parts are going to work loose. On the other hand, if you have a system that's already kind of loose, the water hammer will simply move the tubing around, but it won't put so much pressure on the joint, which is where the failure can happen. So don't stretch it tight. It's okay to use some staples to hold it to the ground. In fact, it will probably be essential, at least during layout stages. But they should be on kind of loose sections. You shouldn't be trying to make it these nice, straight, perfectly mathematical straight lines with perfectly right angles. Those are all bad things with drip systems. So do kind of spend a little time on the planning ahead. It's important for you to understand what your distribution components are planning to be, because you need to have you'll have another point of restriction of water availability once you start distributing that water from that supply tubing out to the plants. So you're going to lay out a system different if you're using a lot of 1/4 inch pre-emitted soaker than if you're using individual point source drippers to each individual plant. And you're going to lay out a different system from either of those options if you're planning on putting staked micro sprayers to cover the area. So, and we'll cover that here in just a minute. But think ahead. Don't just lay out the 1/2 inch, then go shopping for the drip components and realize that, wow, I laid out my supply tubing too far away from where I want the plants to be watered. And so now I have to retroactively figure out a way to deal with that problem. So plan it ahead, you'll be more successful long term. So when it comes to distributing the water, actually applying the water, there's a whole batch of different ways you can get there from here. Basically, we break them down into 2 types of distribution parts. Low flow distribution components are things like individual drip emitters. They'll have flow rates of like 1/2 gallon per hour, 1 gallon per hour, maybe 2 gallons per hour. Other components are high flow. These can be higher flow soakers. Some soakers are actually sprayer soakers or weep through soakers over a large area that take a fair amount of water. Others might be actual spray devices, which will have a rating of maybe 10 or 15 or even as much as 20 gallons per hour for the emission head. So these are all useful components, but they shouldn't be mixed on the same timer zone. And yes, I know there are ways around it if you know what you're doing to sometimes make it kind of work. But generally, you should have separate zones for things that you're going to run on individual point source drippers or pre-emitted 1/4 inch soakers, because they're low flow devices. They're designed to run for long periods of time. Higher flow devices run for shorter periods of time on purpose. And if you try to mix the two, you're going to do one of 2 things. You're going to dramatically underwater your point source emitters, or you're going to create standing water and runoff through your high flow emitters if you're trying to do both on the same system. So just don't plan a separate system for low flow stuff, a separate systems for individual high flow situations. The overall capacity in your system is somewhat variable. There's a variety of things that impact that, but you can generally assume that in a given zone, after pressure regulator at 25 or 30 PSI, you probably have something between 200 and 300, maybe at most 350 gallons per hour available. That becomes important with high flow components in particular. Even if you can fit as much tubing as you want to get where you want to go, if you're doing a lot of high flow components, you're rapidly going to run out of available water in that zone. So you may need to do multiple zones to make it work. So these are typical drip emitter installs here. Drip emitters water slow and deep. People who are not familiar with drip systems will sometimes come back to me a couple of weeks later and say, I don't think it's getting enough water. I should put bigger emitters or no emitters. And they've gone out and they've looked at it, and they see this little 1-inch circle of water where the emission point of the distribution tubing is. And it's an understanding that that is designed to water in basically a downward funnel-shaped pattern. If you're getting an inch of emitted water visible on the soil surface, when you get down there at 12 inches under the soil, that could be 1.5 feet or even 2 feet in diameter, depending on your soil profile and how much water you're actually putting into it. So watering a much bigger area and with much more water than you think. It's just going down. It's not sitting there on the soil surface, wetting the soil surface. That's not to say that you don't necessarily need more flow or more emitters. Large plants, particularly plants with larger horizontal root systems rather than deep root systems, often need more than one emitter, because if you water a 2-foot circle over here, the roots are 7 feet across, like on a big roadie, only one small section of the plant is actually getting water. And you'll notice that because any individual patch of root system of a plant feeds a specific group of branches, and you'll notice that some branches are fine with that and others are beginning to wilt from lack of water. That's because the water is not being distributed widely enough around the root system. So large plants often need more than one emitter or need collars made out of that 1/4-inch pre-emitted soaker tubing again. So you can see a very typical emission setup here in the picture. The individual drippers in this case have been punched right into the 1/2-inch line, the supply line. And then we have an undripped, just a plain 1/4-inch tube that goes from the emitter out to the individual plant where you want the water to go. There are limits to doing that. The biggest limit to doing that is distance. If you are setting up with this with your drippers punched right into the 1/2-inch tube and your tubing going out, you should not be moving more than 3 feet of 1/4-inch tubing after the emitter. If you have to do that because your layout is restricted, you have to do it differently. You have to put an unregulated barb in, so something that doesn't already reduce the actual gallon flow in. Run your 1/4-inch distribution tubing out to where you want it to release, and then you put your emitter at the end of the 1/4-inch distribution tubing rather than back at the 1/2-inch line. That enables you to have much longer runs when you need to. Generally speaking, it's wise to get your 1/2-inch tubing as close to the plants you want to water as is practical, so you don't have to do too many of those double barbed sets. Dripper line is, we used to have to make this, okay? So drip emitters typically are designed to go exactly one way. They only allow water to flow one way, and at the end of their drip, they allow a regulated amount of water through, and that's it. That's the stop point. It's an end point. You can get drip emitters that have a little gap that lets the measured amount of water through, but lets the rest of the water go on by to another section of tubing. It's called inline emitters. We used to use a lot of them because we would do kind of similar things that we now do with pre-emitted dripper line. So pre-emitted dripper line is simply a 1/4-inch distribution tubing. And by the way, in almost every case, 1/4-inch tubing is uniform. You don't see a whole batch of different sizes of that like you do with 1/2-inch tubing. Occasionally, you'll see some rare stuff like spaghetti tube that is different. It's not really designed to run with these systems. So dripper line has a preset emitter built into the 1/4-inch at fixed intervals, usually every 6 inches and 12 inches. Occasionally, you can find some 18-inch gap stuff. And so this just simply saves us from having to cut a foot of tubing and put an inline emitter, and then another foot of tubing and put an inline emitter. It's just built in for us. They are built a little different from a standard emitter, and they do tend to plug readily if you have dirty water. That's very important. If you're using these, you do a very good filtration system to make sure they're not plugging all the time. So each of these emitters usually is approximately 1/2 gallon per hour. Usually 0.6 is the most common. And that does present a kind of finite limit to how much of this you can do from any one connection to your supply tube. So you've got your 1/2-inch supply tube. you're going to punch in, and we'll show some connection sequences here in a minute. Punch in your 1/4-inch barb that does not regulate it. So it's an unregulated barb. It's not a 1, it's not a 1/2, it's not a 2, it's an unregulated barb. Then you'll run a little bit of regular 1/4-inch distribution tubing until you want water to start. You'll put a barb in to connect that to your 1/4-inch dripper line. You'll make a collar around a plant like you see in the picture, or you'll run a straight row down a row of flowers or vegetables. And then that water will come out at every fixed interval. Understand how these things work a little bit. If you put a 12-inch interval 0.6 gallon per hour emitter and you're running 45 minutes in an average soil, you've got spots of water at usable plant root distances with slight gaps in between. So if you've got plants that are wide spaced, those are ideal, or if you can serpentine the tubing a little bit so you've got an emitter right at each plant, those are ideal. A 6-inch interval gives you essentially a solid band of water between 6 and 8 inches wide over the whole area that tubing is covering. Ideal, obviously, uses more water. Ideal for denser plantings, vegetable row crops and flower beds are good examples where we'd use 6-inch interval dripper line. When you put that barb in back at the 1/2 inch, and it's unregulated, but there's some physics involved. And if you're running that between 25 and 30 PSI, the most you're probably getting through that aperture is somewhere in the neighborhood of 25-ish, maybe at most 30 gallons per hour available. So if you're using 1/2 gallon per hour at every emitter, and you've got an emitter every 6 inches, that means you can only run between 12 and 15 feet of 6-inch interval dripper line before you are out of water. So this is not something you can run forever and ever in long rows of. Obviously, the 1 foot, the 1 foot gapping, you can get up to about roughly 30 feet under ideal conditions of run before you have to start another connection from back at the 1/2 inch line because you're out of water. So that does limit their use in certain applications. There are other types of soaker line that are designed for higher flow rates, and we'll talk about them very shortly here. But these dripper lines are great for making a collar to distribute the water around an individual plant, or for making row crops, or in flower pots. We use these a lot for in flower pots and hanging baskets. But there are some limits in how much you can do out of them. And of course, the overall system limits still apply if you've got roughly 250 gallons per hour available in the system, and you put 10 connections in with long runs of 1/4-inch dripper line, you're probably using all the water, all the available water in that system. And if you want to go on past that, you'll need to add a separate timer zone and go on from there. Higher flow applications. Typical high flow applications are higher volume soakers and micro sprayers. You can get micro sprayers in a whole variety of different spray radiuses and flow rates. Many of them are adjustable in terms of the flow rate. Not so many of them are adjustable in terms of the radius. They provide an area coverage of usually overhead watering, which is not ideal for some situations, but in other cases it works quite well. They do use a fairly high flow rate. So if you're used to individual point source emitters at 1/2 gallon per hour, 1 gallon per hour, or maybe 2 gallons per hour, micro sprayers are typically designed to run something around 6 to 10 to 15 to even 25 gallons per hour. That's really, really important number, because you should understand that by the time you have put 10 larger high volume micro sprayers on a system, you're out of water. If you want to expand beyond that, you need to add a separate timer zone on. The higher flow rates are usually correlated with longer throws, longer distances, but not always. They make some very large scale 5 and 6 foot diameter circular sprayers that actually use fairly low volumes, relatively speaking. But generally speaking, if you're putting 6 gallons per hour into an emitter and you have a very similar sprayer that's taking 20 gallons per hour, you're going about 3 times as far in throw distance. So definitely a limited number of them per timer zone. The assembly is usually an unregulated barb into the 1/2 again, out to a riser assembly, the sprayers, which are often designed to thread in and out of the semi-rigid risers, on the stick risers, and on top of the riser from there. You can extend them. I've got some of my vegetable garden. I sometimes run as high as 4 feet off the ground, so that you can go up a bit, and it's acceptable. You can keep them down low. There are some that are designed for like applying a fairly large volume of water. Again, designed for things like blueberries and rhododendrons, large root systems. They call them higher flow bubblers, and they'll create 10 gallons or 15 gallons per hour, covering an area about 8 inches wide or so. And so they'll water a larger span of roots for shallow rooted, broad rooted plants. And those are under canopy. But for most applications of this, you're going to be spraying over the top of the leaf surface. It's not a disaster if you know what you're doing and you time them right. So they're running in the morning, not in the evening, that kind of thing. But not as efficient as individual point source or other low volume type sprays. The other major high flow capacity component is high flow soakers. Some of them are sprayer soakers. They'll usually call them laser tubing. They've got, they're only semi-regulated, they're approximately regulated. So in other words, how much water you get out of them really depends on how much pressure you're putting into them. And they are typically fairly high flow, several gallons per hour per foot. The last one I worked with was a 5 gallon per hour per foot nominal. So you can only run relatively short sections of them, and they do have an actual spray release. So it's kind of like the sprayer style soaker hoses that you attach to your hose. They cover a given area fairly shallowly. You can also get an in-between product. Looks like a recycled rubber hose, but in a 1/4 inch. They're again unregulated. It does depend on how much pressure you put into them. A lot of those are around 2 or maybe 3 gallons per hour per foot. So still quite a bit of water usage, but less water than the sprayers, and they're not spraying out. They're confining it to weeping out over the side of the tubing and down into the soil from there. Make great drip collars for some applications, but do be aware of the extra water use. A lot of other accessories that you may want to include in a drip system or may use to assemble a drip system. They make mounting clips, both in 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch, for if you need to nail them down to a hard surface, like the edge of a deck, or as you can see in the picture, going up a vertical upright to get up to a higher level, like to go up to a deck rail or whatever. You want to make sure those tubings are well secured. These little nail-on mounting clips are very effective. Aluminum staples help hold tubing in the ground. It's going to be used for both 1/2 inch tubing and 1/4 inch distribution tubing. It just simply enables you to keep that tubing about where you want it, so it's not getting tripped over all the time or getting shifted by even passing animals or whatever, and no longer putting the water where you want it. Shutoff valves are also available in both 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch components. This might be useful if there's parts of your system that you want to run seasonally, but the rest of it you want to run more frequently. And it simply enables you to turn part of the system off while the rest of the system continues to work on its regular timing. Hole punches are not, are in between essential and optional. You can do other means of attaching your drip components into your 1/2 inch tubing, but the hole punches are really well designed for doing that, and we'll demonstrate that here in a second. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more now about layout and how this works, and then we'll go into showing the actual attachment sequences. We like I like to use what we call the 200-200 rule, and as I said a little while ago, it's a very conservative number. We assume you have about 200 linear feet of available tubing and about 200 feet of available, or 200 gallons per hour of available water. You actually, in almost every system, will have more than that. That's a very conservative estimate. Keep in mind that this is all measured after the pressure regulator. What happens after the pressure regulator is much more impactful on how the system works than what happens before. So for an example, a lot of my zones at home, I may not run 1/2 inch tubing all the way back to the hose bib at the house. Instead, I'll run a traditional garden hose out to the shut off and timer. So I've got 50 feet of garden hose at full pressure before I start my distribution, supply and distribution lines out there in the garden. So this simply enables me to save that extra water loss I would have running that extra 50 feet of tubing, so I can have more tubing on the zones out there. So After pressure regulator, that's when you start measuring that 200 as far as available feet. So straight runs are ideal when they can be managed, as long as you're not trying to nail them down and create water hammer problems like we suggested. Tees are often essential because you may want to do things in different areas, and they're not an inherently bad thing, but lots and lots of tees on a system will dramatically impact how much tubing and how much available water you have in each arm of that zone. As we already kind of talked about, curves are better than right angles when they can be managed, and they can't always. Don't intentionally avoid a right angle if it's the right choice for your application. But if you are doing a right angle, do definitely splice in an elbow, a half-inch elbow. That's really less important on the quarter-inch tubing because of the amount of water and the distances involved. And sometimes we will use elbows and tees on the quarter-inch tubing. Always keep in mind on your distribution components, your quarter-inch components, how much water you put into that at the beginning. So if you're putting a 2 gallon per hour emitter in and a section of quarter-inch tubing, and then you want to tee it so it goes 2 ways, you can do that. You would figure that each of those arms would then get 1 gallon per hour. In practice, that may not be accurate because there's a lot of variables, in fact, impacting how that water is going to flow through that tee. It's not a regulated tee. On the other hand, if you're putting roughly 20 gallons per hour in an unregulated barb in, and then you want to put a couple of tees into that to put individual drippers further away, that is quite doable as long as you're not overdoing. So we talked a little bit about this. Running the supply line as close to the distribution points as is practical. So you want to run your half-inch tubing relatively near where you want the water to come out because you don't want to have long runs of quarter-inch tubing. They're even more restrictive than the half itself is. A good rule of thumb is about 3 feet. You can get if you can get within about 3 feet, you don't need to take special precautions to get enough water out. You can just put your drippers right into the half-inch tube, use your quarter-inch to go to where you want the water to release. If you're exceeding 3 feet, you really have to do the barbing, the unregulated barb to the tubing, to the emitter, or you're no longer getting your listed 1 or 2 gallons per hour. You'll still get some water often enough, but it may not be as much as you think. Slope is kind of a special case. Generally speaking, you want to run your supply lines on contour. You don't want to run your half-inch up and down within its distribution area. It's okay to run half-inch up a post, up to a deck rail, put a T in, and then run your whole deck rail at the same elevation, because that's where all your distribution is coming out. But if you were to then put a quarter-inch in there at the bottom of that to water some plants down along the footing of the patio, they'll get more water because there's more water pressure than the top stuff will. So it's something you need to keep in mind. But generally speaking, follow the contour as best you can. The emitters we use, the drip emitters, are pressure compensating within reasonable limits. Usually anything over about 5 psi they'll correct for. So when you need to go up or down slope, you run your half-inch line lateral along the slope. You put in an unregulated barb, run your quarter-inch up to the plant, but your pressure compensating emitter at the uphill, and you do the same thing on the downhill ends. It's not perfect, but that will correct for a lot of the difference in pressure problems of going up and downhill. You can only do so much of it on steep slopes. There are limits to what you can make drip systems do. So I'll talk a little bit about making connections here. This is where people get a little bit confused about how it should go or how it works and how to make it work. There's a lot of different types of compression fitting out there for half-inch. Most of them are just fine. Some of them are easier to use than others. I'll show you the types we sell, but there are other types out there that are just as good for making the connection. So making a cut in a half-inch tube. They make fancy cutters, tubing cutters that are designed specifically for that. I would love to sell you tubing cutters, and that's fine. You don't have to have them. regular hand pruners actually cut through this tubing very, very nicely. And that's usually what I end up using at home because I always have one at hand. You want to make your cut as relatively square as possible. You can be a little off. It's not really going to impact much. Nice square cut. If you are heavily slanted, like that, your compression fitting may not fully engage. It may leak or it may come apart because it's not catching fully. So square cuts. Compression fittings go on a bit hard on purpose. You should be having to work at it. If it just slides right on, you probably have the wrong size component for the tubing you're using. So you want to grip your tubing with only a small stub of loose tubing at the end. If you're gripping clear back here, when you try to push this fitting on, it's going to bend and crimp. So give yourself just a few inches of space. Compression fitting should go on with a steady pressure and a little bit of twist. It does not have to go all the way into the fitting to be engaged. There's a little flange right here, right at near the very end of it, that the hose tip has to get past so it can grip. So you only have to get just a little bit into that fitting, and now you have a pressure fast connection for that 1/2-inch tube. You can, if you're working on an old system, you want to save parts, and when you're taking things apart, you can theoretically get this tubing out of this type of fitting. You might find it's cheaper to spend the extra couple of bucks per fitting to buy new ones than it is to spend the intense amount of times it takes to actually get this tubing back out with combination of cutting and pliers to pull it out. It's doable. I've done it. You can salvage parts that way, but it's time consuming and it's a lot of effort. So 1/4-inch connections, again, 1/4-inch cuts really readily with standard secateurs, and you do want to make, again, relatively square cuts, or the barbs may not engage appropriately. When you are making an attachment with a drip emitter, you'll find there's all kinds of models and makes of drip emitters. Some of them are slightly different from others. This is a pretty typical 1/2 gallon per hour emitter right here. Different brands will be color coded differently. It's one of the intense frustrations in the retail end of this, that and the multiple sizes of 1/2-inch. So if this is a Rainbird red colored fitting, this is a 2 gallon per hour emitter. But as this is an Agrifin brand red tipped emitter, it's a 1/2 gallon per hour. So the color coding within any brand is consistent, but between brands is not at all. In most cases, when you've got a emitter like this, you will note that there is, in fact, a sharp end and a dull end. Water really only flows one way through these. The sharp end is towards the water supply. The blunt end is towards where the water finishes releasing. With relatively strong fingers and a little bit of practice, you can actually punch this right into your 1/2-inch tubing without any tools at all. It is absolutely doable. I've done it many, 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 many times. But that's not really the easiest way to do it. It's just quick. And if you're doing one of them, and you got the hand strength and you're not too worried about it, go for it. You need to push them in and make sure they've fully engaged so the barb is past the sidewall. So do give them a tug check to make sure they're fully seated. So from there, then your 1/4-inch tubing just simply slides right over the blunt barb. It's a bit of a tight fit, but not as hard as getting a 1/2-inch compression fitting on. And your distribution tubing will now run out and let the water out wherever you stop it, wherever you let it go. So this is 1/2 gallon per hour starting here and losing a 1/2 gallon per hour to the ground right at the end. And this is less than 3 feet, though just barely. So we haven't had any real loss of pressure and water from that point. Ideally, if you're going to do a batch of these, you'll want to pre-punch your holes. Then the emitters go in a lot easier. And You can use a hole punch or you can use an awl, but they tend to make slightly asymmetrical holes with kind of a tattered tear through where they go through. And long term, that can cause tearing or failure of the 1/2-inch tubing where they're punched through. These hole punches that are designed for drip tubing give you a couple of advantages. They actually cut out a small circle of the actual tubing material. And you push and twist and they go through, and when you pull it out, you have a nice round hole. The other thing is they're of such a length that it's really, really hard to accidentally punch through both walls. If you do that with a pocket knife or with an awl or with a screwdriver, your odds of actually going through both walls is fairly significant, and I've done that before. So the hole punches that are designed for that do make that simpler. When you have a situation where you have a hole where you do not want a hole anymore, you can put a plug in. They make Goof Plugs that are designed to replace an emitter in a hole or to go even at the end of a 1/4 inch to stop a line. If you were, for some reason, needing to pull an emitter out, you can't really do it with fingers. You can do it with a pair of pliers. You can also do it, again, with your secateurs. Just get under the rim and you twist the wrist, and it will pop out under that steady pressure. You can reuse that hole maybe once, maybe twice before you've gotten too much tear and it's no longer holding the emitter cleanly or it's leaking pretty substantially. But that's kind of the basic connection set there. And you can see the connections for a couple of other options here. The most common option you're going to run into is either a micro sprayer or a pre-emitted dripper. And the same things basically still apply. You need to punch a hole into your 1/2-inch tubing, like we did. And then you need an unregulated barb, something that is not a 1 or a 2 or other type of emitter, but has no limitation on the water coming through. And then that goes into that hole you've punched. Then you'll run your 1/4 inch tube off of that. And then you will have whatever type of assembly you're going into coming off this end. And on the right-hand picture there, you can see a real common setup. That's a stake and riser assembly. It's already got a 1/4 inch barb built into the stake itself. The riser threads on top of that. So you just plug that 1/4 inch tube into that barb, and then the water will come out the top of the riser, and you can put whatever size of sprayer you're putting onto it. Dripper line is very similar. If you need your dripper line to start right at your 1/2 inch, it's golden. You simply put your barb in, you start with your dripper line, and you keep running it as far as you intend to run it and as far as it will allow. In most cases, that's simply not going to be the case, and you're going to need to create at least a little interim space of basic distribution tubing. So you put an unregulated barb into your 1/2 inch, you run straight distribution tubing with no emitters or holes in it to where you want to start your soaker line. And there you can put in a T to make a collar, or you can put in another barb just to start a straight line of the soaker tube. If you do not make a circle with the dripper line or the soaker tube, water keeps coming out the end and you're not releasing it where you want it. You'll need to end that. And we just simply use a goof plug to stop that line, so the water will then come out of the emission points rather than out the end. So, common questions we get when we're getting started on drip systems. How big of emitters should I be using? How many emitters should I be using? Well, we talked about the system limitations, 200 to 300 gallons per hour max. And typically, if you're using point source emitters, you can really maximize that. If you're using micro sprayers, you better give yourself some cushion. There's things that interfere. A good rule of thumb is for any given zone, figure out for the plants that you're watering relative thirst and need. If you take your average plants and give them 1, or in some cases on bigger plants more, 1 gallon per hour emitters, then you can make thirstier plants get a 2 gallon per hour emitter, and more drought tolerant plants get a 1/2 gallon per hour emitter, and kind of regulate your system that way. So they'll all run the same time, getting slightly different amounts of water. The how many, it often gets to be kind of a tricky point. If you have a really small shrub, like a 1.5 foot or 2 foot Hebe shrub, or a clump of perennial that's about 18 inches across, a single point source emitter is quite adequate to provide enough water for that plant over enough surface area. For larger plants and shallower rooted plants, they will need more to get there. And either you do the collars of pre-emitted soaker for larger shrubs, or you do multiple emitters out. Typically, something that's shallow rooted and thirsty, like a rhododendron, will do 2 or 3 2-gallon per hour emitters, so we're throwing more water flow rate at them. At least 2 to balance the water flow through the root system, but if they're particularly large, you might need to set that up as 3 emitters instead. What kind of a timing run should you be using? Well, some variability with individual plants and soil types. General rules of thumb, a low flow system, pre-emitted soakers or individual drippers, usually runs around 45 minutes, anywhere from 45 to an hour, maybe an hour and a half at the most. If you're using higher flow emitters, whether that's higher flow soakers or sprayers, the run times are usually about half that, usually 20 to 30 minutes, occasionally as low as 15. And you're going to have to balance that by a little trial and error on your soil type. If you're accumulating standing surface water, you should be breaking it up into more frequent, shorter runs. If you're flowing down into the soil readily, you can run slightly longer runs and less frequent runs to make up for it. But generally speaking, high flow application systems, 15 to 30 minutes, and low flow drippers, 45 minutes to an hour and a half are your typical run times. We talked about the mixing high flow and low flow components. Everybody wants to do it because they don't want to set up more timers. Timers are one of the more expensive parts of the system, and they just want to keep it simple and not run more parts than they have to. But really, it's not ideal. There are ways you can tweak it somewhat if you're really good at it, but it's challenging to get it to work well. You're far ahead to either go all high flow, go all low flow, or at least have separate timer zones for each type of application. Can you use drip irrigation in raised beds, in hanging baskets, in planter pots on the patio? Absolutely. Run times and frequency will have to be adjusted for the amount of soil available in those pots, because it's a limited soil profile. And there will be some trial and error, but we do a lot of this. We've got our hanging baskets on our front porch here at the nursery are all on drippers, and we're using the pre-emitted soaker option, so that's how we water them. In practice, we set that up for 2 runs a day at 15 minutes. It's less than you would normally do for that type of component, but if we run them the full 45 minutes, we're spilling a lot of water on the cement, and because the small amount of soil just saturates up. So sometimes you'll need to do that kind of adjustment. So run it, morning and evening and shorter periods, because you can only hold so much water in the available soil. But it is a good way for watering baskets, raised bed gardens, small planters, that kind of thing. Very efficient way to do it. The usual approach is to use that pre-emitted soaker these days on really large diameter pots. You can use some of the lower angle, shorter sprayers. I have done that. It's really common for them to get disturbed just enough to not work well. So those pre-emitted soakers are really probably the overall best way to do those. All right, so we've kind of gone over drip system components and such. I welcome any questions either in chat, or if anybody wants to unmute and talk. I'd love to chat with you there. Oh, no questions. That means I've either confused you or I've talked you to sleep. You guys all know where to find me. I've got email here at Shonnard's, or you can contact me by phone here. I'm happy to chat with you about these systems. We do have these components available as well. If you're still really confused about the whole thing, come and see me. I've got variations of most of these types of components installed at various locations around the nursery. We can turn them on by hand. You can see what they do, and we'd be happy to help you out with that. Thank you very much for attending, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks, Kathy. Appreciate it. Uh-oh, Dan can't come off mute.
Hear me now, Dan?
Hey, I got you, Dan. How you doing?
Hey there. It's sorry. I was had system versus Zoom settings
I don't know
differently.
what you mean. Computers work perfectly every time, right?
Yeah. So at one point I was a little confused about. So you were saying when you have you got your 1/2 inch, you plug your regulator and then run your into the 1/2 inch, and then you run the 1/4. If you're just doing a point, like a point emitter, do you just leave it open ended, or do you or if it's longer than 3 feet, plug an unrestricted emitter directly into the 1/2 inch, and then put your, I guess, your emitter or whatever at the long end?
Yes.
I wasn't okay.
That's correct. Yeah. So if your 1/2 inch is right adjacent to the plant you want to water, and you can simply put that emitter in and just leave it literally open. It'll just drip right there, and that's fine. That's seldom the case, but there are a few plants on any given system are usually that conveniently located. If you're within 3 feet, you put your regulated emitter in, your 1/2 gallon or 1 gallon or 2 gallon per hour emitter in, you run your 1/4 inch over it. They make fancy little bug plugs and stuff you can put in them to theoretically reduce erosion because you're not getting as much volume of water out there dispersing it, and to keep bugs from calling back down the line. I don't know anybody who actually uses those things, honestly. They're kind of a pain. We just normally leave that 1/4 inch tube open at the point where you want the water to come out. And if you're longer than 3 feet, you put an unregulated barb in, so you have maximum amount of water flow and pressure. You run your 4 or 5 or 6 feet of 1/4 inch tubing. Not ideal, but in certain circumstances, that's what you got to do. Then you put your actual point source emitter, your 1 gallon or 2 gallon or whatever emitter, at the end of the 1/4 right next to the plant, and just leave that open.
And so is it typically the recommendation to put that restricted emitter directly into the 1/2 inch, and that not on the end? Is you're just reducing the equipment you're using? You don't need that unregulated, or the unregulated connector or whatever in between the 1/4 and the 1/2 inch? Is that
that's correct. Either one works just fine. But the more connections you have, the more possible points of failure, and of course, the more labor and the more parts involved. So
right. Okay. That, I guess, that makes sense. The other thing is, so you're saying if you got 200 feet from the point of your pressure regulator, and you run like a garden hose out to the end, if you've got a really long run. I have a really long run, and I was almost just thinking, since I'm going to be leaving it in, I could just run 1/2 inch all the way out there and then put the pressure regulator at that end. Is that acceptable?
you have to pay attention to those 1/2 inch components that are on the higher pressure part of that. That's usually not the part that fails, by the way. When you get too much pressure in, it's usually you start blowing barbs out of the 1/2 inch. You start blowing the distribution pieces out of the 1/2 inch. But it is theoretically possible you get enough pressure to actually separate your 1/2 inch. So you've got your 1/2 inch connection at the hose bib and your 1/2 inch connection at the other end of the pressure regulator. You can do that, just watch them, because you could have some failure. It's not quite as efficient to use 1/2 inch drip system as used to use garden hose, because garden hose is designed for less friction loss, and it's a slightly larger diameter. It's usually a 5/8 diameter. But garden hoses, if you leave them hooked up for a long time with pressure, are going to fail too. So that's a problem. That's a problem with my layout that I've had before. So not a perfect answer. A perfect answer is to run a trench and throw some PVC out there and put a new hose bib right where you want it. But I had that, and I kept fighting it with the in-ground install out there and hitting it with the tiller and all that kind of stuff. So I stopped.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's that aligns with what I was thinking. Okay. I had another one that you had mentioned. Well, okay. So collars versus single emitters. Is there any kind of rule of thumb as far as, I mean, if you've got I've got some of that, not the recycled tired like soaker hose stuff, but the pin, I don't know, laser drilled soaker hose or drip line, I guess is what they would call it. That I could make a pretty, I guess that would make a good collar off of a T, or just run multiple, I guess run a single 1/4 line out there, put a T in it, and then run emitters off of it. You know, is there any kind of rule of thumb about which is better, or do you want to run off the 1/2 inch multiple 1/4 to multiple emitters and just spread them out?
A lot of it is practical decision making in the field. How is this going to work? Number one, and how easy is the relative connections? So you've got pre-emitted quarter dripper, so it's got like a emitter every 6 inches or 12 inches, or you've got a laser one that actually sprays.
Okay, and is it are the regulated emitters? Do they always have that little kind of bulbous, like it almost looks like, if you think of a snake that's eaten a gopher or something, that's got that little bit of a bulb in line with them periodically. Is that
Yep.
what those regulated? Okay.
That's a pre-emitted quarter. They actually make pre-emitted half too. I told you there's only so much I can talk about in an hour. There's a lot of components out there. I don't use or sell the pre-emitted half, but it's used commonly in the landscape trade. The pre-emitted quarter like that is really efficient for making collars, and you would want an unregulated barb out to it, and then you can either, we used to do a lot of T's, and we still do this fairly frequently. Put a T in, then you put your dripper around and link it back into the T. And now you've got that dripper is definitely around the crown of that tree, because it can't go anywhere, it's trapped. Water, really, you don't gain any benefit by trying to counter pressure it, so it's to get the water going both ways, and it's just as effective generally to put a straight barb and just do a little curlicue of the soaker.
Okay.
Soaker. That's just great. If you want to be simple, you put a goof plug in the end. If you want to be fancy, you put another 1/2 gallon per hour in the end for one more emission point. But that can get dislodged because it's not fixed around that trunk, so it can get disturbed, and now you're watering over here instead of watering over here. That's the only disadvantage doing that way. That's how we do most pots and containers. We'll do a curlicue inside.
Okay.
So other than that, like I say, it's practical decision making at that point. And rules of thumb. So a perennial clump larger than 2 feet or a shrub larger than 4 feet probably needs more than one emitter to get an even watering coverage. If it's marginal, like my roses, they're 4 to 5 to 6 foot, I've got 2 emitters to each rose. They're individual emitter at the 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch line on each side of the rose, diametrically opposed to balance out the water. On a rhodie, it's easier to do a drip collar because you really want to distribute that water pretty broadly to get nice even coverage. So
if you've got a pre-regulated drip line, it's what, 1/2 gallon. What was the max length you said? 12 feet? I didn't quite catch that.
It has to do with your actual flow rates. When you put an unregulated barb in, we're assuming you're getting about 25 to 30 gallons per hour. Each of those emission points is a 1/2 gallon per hour. So if you've got an emission point every 6 inches, you're going through a full gallon per foot, and your ultimate maximum is like 25 feet. But honestly, in practical terms, I've never seen anybody succeed at a run that length. You're more like 13 or 14 feet of 6 inch pre-emitted. Okay. If your emission points are at a foot apart, you can almost double that maximum. And the better brands, and frankly, most of them these days, will say right on the package, do not exceed 16 feet, do not exceed 33 feet.
Okay, gotcha.
But I go cautious from that. I never try to maximize the runs on those, because they're assuming that you've got a nice clean circular hole and that you have no problem with fouling or manufacturer's defects on that barb, and you are actually getting a full 30 gallons per hour out of that unregulated bar. So you're using at least 25, maybe 30 psi. They make a lot of assumptions when they say 30 feet, 33 feet. I tend to be a little more conservative than that when I'm laying mine out, because you never know.
Right, gotcha. So I've bought and actually installed a lot of what I now think that non-regulated dripper hose. And I have noticed if I don't put a regulator at some point in there, a half gallon, whatever gallon, they spray almost, and it's kind of like, is there a, would you just typically put a half gallon regulator on if I've already got the stuff installed? I don't want to try and redo it.
You need to put something in that or you can get some specially like 5 gallon per hour. A half gallon per hour. Okay, so picture this: you've got a collar that's this big around. Say it's covering a area with a circumference of, with a diameter of 18 inches, circumference of 30 some inches, right? So theoretically, that's using 6 gallons per hour nominal flow rate. Most of those are listed for approximately 2 gallons per hour per foot. If you put a half gallon per hour in it, you might disperse that half gallon per hour fairly evenly over that circle, but you might not. You might end up watering only one part of the arc before it runs out of water. So you need enough water in it for it to function.
Right.
2 gallons often will work. You can get specialty 5 and 10 gallon per hour emitters if you hunt. You may have to go online to get them, but they make them for that type of application specifically. I usually use mine with an unregulated barb and let them have a little bit of spray. It's all right.
Okay. Actually, that's pretty much what I'm.
My experience with those has been that if you do not bury them, they start decomposing in the sunlight in about 4 years. They're not as durable as some of the other drip components.
Okay, so yeah, so typically I put the plants in, snake them through depending on what it is, like onions or something that's kind of, and then just put a little bit of a dusting of something over them, just to kind of
keep enough UV off them. That's all we're concerned about.
Okay. And same with the 1/2 inch.
So yes, your 1/2 inch and your regular traditional 1/4 inch and your pre-emitted 1/4 inch will UV degrade over time. It happens. If they are buried, it happens much more slowly. But it's not on that short-term failure like with that recycled rubber soaker line. I've got my garden this place is 26 years, if I'm remembering correctly. I have changed out the entire drip system components once. I replaced the whole 1/2 inch tubing line. Granted, I pull a lot of those lines onto the porch where they're not sitting out in the sun all winter too. Right. It does extend their life a bit, which is kind of a pain to relay it out every year, but I would rather have it last a little longer. So I think my replacement point was something like between year 12 and year 15. That's when I finally threw the old ones away, salvaged out. Most of the emitters were still good. I salvaged them out. Some of the 1/4 was still good. Some of it wasn't. I only salvaged a little bit of that, but I threw all the 1/2 inch out and started over with a fresh 1/2 inch. So yes, it happens. They are better buried. They do last longer buried. If you bury them too deep, there's a risk of actual soil pressure compressing them, and then you suddenly have failures with water not getting through anymore. So bury them shallow. If you areas that are high foot traffic, put a trench in and put some 3/4 inch PVC and run the 1/2 inch tubing through that PVC, so you don't crush them when you under constant foot traffic pressure.
Right. Taking notes as you go. If you've got don't mean to monopolize it. If other people have questions, so just cut me off. But so for the drip hose lines that are every 6 inches, what was the gallon per foot on that again?
So if it's every 6 inches, there's different brands out there. Most of them are 0.6 gallons per hour. We just call that a half because it's close enough. And so every foot is a full gallon per hour.
Okay, gotcha. Well, no, I was just thinking about total maximum emitters and different lines.
Yes, and you don't think about it so much when you're putting 1 gallon per hour emitters into a 1/2 inch tube, but when you suddenly realize I've got 100 feet of pre-emitted soaker at 6-inch intervals, there's 100 gallons per hour right there. So,
right.
right.
And
It does matter.
And typically on a 30 to 35 psi system, total flow through that was what again?
If you had an ideal, I'm sorry, my math isn't that good. If you had an ideal situation, I think it's around 350 gallons per hour, given the coefficient of friction on that tubing. In practice, we use a 200 gallon per hour rule. You're probably closer to 300 with that type of emitter versus sprayers. So somewhere between 200 and 300 gallons per hour total.
Okay. And one last thing you said there at the end. So for like raised beds, it's this. Would you recommend the recycled tire soaker hoses for that, or the drip lines that are regulated? Or
I would base that on how you're using the system. If you really want to run 20-minute sets, you use the recycled tubing set, and that's fine. 15, 20, 25-minute sets. If you don't mind running it for an hour, those pre-emitteds are highly efficient at doing that. You can run more linear footage of them because the pre-emitteds, even on the 6-inch interval, are only using 1 gallon per hour and per foot, and the flow through soaker is nominally 2 gallons per hour per foot, but is completely unregulated. So if you had, if that was going downhill, you'd get all the water down here on this end. You wouldn't be getting any of it up here. Right.
Yeah. And you said for those unregulated drip hoses, you don't put any regulators on it. You just run it.
I don't. You can, but it's really hard to get it right because they are unregulated soak-throughs on their own, and if you try to regulate them in the inlet end, a lot of times you just don't have enough water for them to work at all.
Right. Well, I've got some situations where I've got some beds that, and I don't know if it's just newer hosing and calcium's plugged up the holes or what, but some are spraying, and then other ones just don't even look like they're getting hardly any water through it. So, yeah. I mean, I'll just probably replace the lines, but I wasn't sure. I was almost thinking, well, why don't I just put a regulator in that line to keep the stuff from spraying, which I guess probably would work, but or covering it with the dirt more might help too.
Covering it with dirt more is another good option to actually reduce it won't reduce per se the water usage, but it will reduce where that water is ending up. So yes, that's certainly an option. They typically have a pretty heavy bead with a little bit of spray, but yeah, some of my overpressured systems that I cheat because I know what I'm doing and don't put pressure regulators on them, I get a pretty good spray out of them. You can cheat on all of this after you've done it enough years, and you know what to expect out of them. I hate to say too much of that in an introductory drip class, but yeah, once you've played with them a while, you find that there's some wiggle room and fidgeting, and you can do with these things.
Yeah. So you just said you don't use pressure
on some systems. I got some systems that are unregulated, and I simply control how fast and how much water I turn on and how fast I turn it on to reduce the impacts on the system.
Gotcha. Okay.
But you can't do with a timer. Timers are usually all or none.
Boom. Yeah, you hear those things click on and the water's pumping.
A lot of the better ones have a 2-cycle, by the way, for that. So like I mentioned the Klebers, and they're a double click. So when you first activate them, turn them on, you hear the click and you get that little thump, and they only let the water so far into it, and then they equalize the pressure a little bit, and then they let the rest of the water in. That helps some with that too. It's not perfect, but that helps some with that. Yeah.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Well, great. Awesome. Thank you, Darren. This was very informative. I thought I actually had a lot of this down, and then I'm like, okay, as I was laying stuff out, I'm like, some of this is just not working quite right. I've got something wrong here, but all right. That's great. Well, thank you. This was awesome.
All right. Done. Thanks, Dan.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Nobody else wants to unmute and ask or type anything into chat. We'll call it a day then.